Welcome. We're here to have another discussion about the writings of the philosopher Alan Gewirth. Today we're going to be talking with Per Bauhn. Per Bauhn is Emeritus Professor of Practical Philosophy at Linnaeus University in Sweden. He has published many books and journal articles in moral and political philosophy, especially on human rights and on Alan Gewirth's moral theory. He also participates frequently in philosophy programs on Swedish national radio and contributes articles to leading Swedish newspapers on topics relating to human freedom, justice, and rights. Welcome, Per.
Thank you.
So I've got a question here for you that I wish you would address. Given that Alan Gewirth's theory is a rational one with a focus on reason and logical consistency, how much room is there for emotions and passions, the ingredients of which many philosophers, at least since David Hume, have thought to be essential to morality?
Well, thank you for the question, Michael. I would say that emotions are present in Gewirth's theory, although in a rather subdued form. They appear originally in his theory in the form of the agent's necessary evaluation of her purposes as something good. Already there is a certain kind of emotional evaluative component that the agent thinks of her purposes as good, and then following this in her evaluation of the necessary conditions of successful agency as necessary goods. So there is a certain kind of emotive, at least, component in his theory, in the sense that the agent has to make this kind of necessary evaluations of her purposes. And in general speaking, one can say, and that is, of course, an older theory than Alan's about agency, that all kinds of agency involves a certain kind of desire, a desire that a certain goal or purpose should be realized. Without that desire, the action process, the agency wouldn't get started in the first place. However, one should also, in all fairness to Alan Gewirth's theory, remember that his main purpose is to show how a moral theory can be justified. Rather than, so he's basically into justification rather than motivation in morality. So for him, questions relating to justification has to be answered in terms of reason, by referring to reasons that all agents are rationally compelled to accept. That is part of how he lays out his theory. So because if he would have based his theory on emotions, on subjectivity, then he wouldn't get the kind of certainty that he wants to underpin his theory. However, I also believe that there is another way in which an emotive component enters into Alan Gewirth's theory, and that is actually in his account of how a rights-respecting agent perceives herself, namely with a certain self-respect. He writes, and I quote from Self-Fulfillment, "In self-respect, what one values is one's moral qualities, including one's dignity as a moral person who is worthy of the respect of other persons," end quote. And here there is a certain a rational agent, a rational person, according to Alan, would take a positive view of herself when she acts in accordance with reason. There is a certain pride that the agent takes in actually being fulfilling the requirements of reason. She enjoys the person she is. She respects herself, and she believes herself to deserve the respect of others. And I would say that is a kind of emotional component too, in the agent's sense of dignity, in her sense of her own worth, in her respect for herself. At the same time, this pride is also modified by her understanding of other people as rights holders and of herself as owing them respect in turn. So there is, in that sense, also there is a certain kind of emotive component in a rational agent's way of perceiving herself, given that she accepts that other people have rights and she believes herself to be acting in accordance with these rights. And another thing one could note is that one could expect a Gewirthian rational agent to be quite passionate about social justice, for instance. And that was very much, I think, true about Alan himself while he was alive, that he was quite passionate about welfare rights and about the equal rights of all people and all citizens within a state to have their rights protected by the state. So in that sense, I think one could say that one could assume at least that a Gewirthian rational agent would be quite passionate about social justice and believing that people deserve societal protection of their rights to, especially to basic well-being, and deserve it as a matter of right and not just as a matter of charity or benevolence. So a Gewirthian rational agent would be a socially responsible citizen, and in that it is included also that she would be supportive of a just society and its institutions and take whatever step is in her power to promote such institutions. So that in these ways, I think that there's room for some emotions and evaluations in Alan's theory.
Good, thank you. I have a second question here for you. What guidance can Gewirth's theory provide in relation to contemporary problems, such as global environmental degradation or the aggression of powerful states against their neighbors? Russia v. Ukraine and China v. Taiwan come to mind. These problems seem to have a scope that goes beyond things between individual agents that there we have between the citizens and their state, areas which Gewirth has discussed in great detail in his books. Do agents or their states have a duty to rescue? Gewirth talks about comparative cost conditions. How would this play out at the level of global duties to rescue?
Yeah, this is a big question, and here we are a bit on tentative grounds because we can't find all the clues in Alan's own work, but one can try to extrapolate from some of his writings. At the time of his death, he was writing on a book about global justice. That was never finished, so we don't know what he intended for that. In his previous books, he had come into these questions about global duties of assistance, international duties in that way. In Human Rights, his book Human Rights from 1982, he discusses duties of international assistance, for instance, to relieve people of starvation in third world countries and so on. In the Community of Rights from 1996, he briefly comments on this kind of assistance duties and says that it's important that they are performed in a way that actually promotes development and independence in the recipient nations and their populations, rather than reinforcing a structure of dependency. So there one have certain clues to how he thinks of this, that the importance of all kinds of global assistance duties has to be that they are promotive of freedom and well-being rather than creating dependency. Now, if one thinks of this kind of global crisis situations, emergency situations, you mentioned situations of war and international conflict, Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan, and we have also all the discussion about global warming, climate change, and which also calls for some kind of action, because all of these situations have a very serious impact on people's basic well-being and also their freedom. Of course, to the extent that people are deprived not only of maybe of their lives, but they might be deprived of their livelihood. People might be forced to be refugees in other countries and so on and so forth. It all attacks and undermines people's human rights in the way that Alan describes these rights. So what could be done about them? Yes, when we discussed the duty to rescue, that is normally in Alan's theory, it is about one individual coming to the rescue of another person in need. For instance, a person about to drown, a person in a burning house, And the question is about, we have a duty to intervene to the extent that we can do so without suffering the same kind of risks to our own basic well-being in the process. But these problems that we are discussing now, global issues, they are more of a structural nature. It is not so easy for individuals to come together and save individual other recipients in these matters. So it has to be obviously at the level of states. And then one can also, of course, believe that also states, because states in Alan's theory are justified by the very fact that they provide an institutional protection of human rights for their own citizens. And here states would be some kind of collective agent. And these states might also be considered as having a duty to intervene when it's necessary to save people in emergency situations in other countries, sometimes maybe even to intervene in an ongoing civil war to prevent massacres of minorities and similar things. However, to the extent that we think of it as a duty to rescue at the level of states, then of course states can also invoke this comparable cost condition and say that there are limits to how much we can expose our own citizen to the risk of intervening, for instance, in an international conflict. Because then the whole nation and its military become some kind of rescuing agent, and that rescuing agent also have rights to their lives. So there will be this kind of balancing of risks. The risk to the people in need, the risk to the people who are supposed to intervene to avert that kind of need. So the comparable cost condition would come into the picture. But there is another way of thinking of this kind of global intervention, and that might be put things in a different matter. At least when people talk about global environmental degradation and climate change and things like that, one can think of it more in terms of collective self-defense, because it affects not only one country, but many countries. And when we come to self-defense, then we are already accepting that we are in danger already. We have to do something to avert it. It is not like a rescue who from a comfortable original position can decide whether or not to intervene in an ongoing crisis, but it's rather we are already facing a danger. We have to do something now. So it's not a matter of trying to avoid risk. We are already at risk and we have to do something for it. And one could think of global problems in global, especially a crisis of this kind of thing that affects globally and have global effects and not only individual nations. That could motivate a discussion of this kind of thing, like a collective self-defense thinking. Then, of course, the question is which states are supposed to be part of this collective self-defense, because we also know that different states have different agendas, different interests, and certainly not everyone is interested of preventing either global change or make anything that can jeopardize their trades or profits from other kind of business that they are dealing in, businesses that might also be actually driving the motor behind all of this global change, polluting the air and environment and so on. I think that one has to, if one follows Alan's idea that we should look for the protection both of freedom and well-being, I think that democracies might have a reason, or not maybe even a duty, to find cooperation with other democracies rather than, as they do now, placing themselves in a situation of dependency in relation to various autocratic and dictatorial systems, which provides them with fuel and energy and oil and whatever they need, natural gas and so on. Because we see now, when there are various kinds of global conflicts and emergency situations, how difficult certain democracies find it to act independently, because they also know that they are already at the mercy of certain of these autocratic regimes. They thought that they were going to change China into a democracy by operating trade. Instead, they become dependent on the Chinese regime and become very reluctant to criticize it. And we know European powers that have been depending on Russian gas and oil for a very long time and found it very difficult to take part in sanctions against Russia now. So I think that if one really wants to find a basis for a future kind of collective self-defense, it should also be based on democracies cooperating with democracies in order to make sure at least that they don't involve themselves in alliances that contribute directly or indirectly to promote and strengthen various kinds of dictatorship instead of actually bringing more democracy to people, generally speaking. So I think one has to quote less respectful writers, one has to be careful with what people one goes to bed with, because otherwise one can wake up in a horrible situation, and quite embarrassing too, as we see in international politics these days.
Yeah, and in that idea, do you see any role for the United Nations?
Well, that would be a very reformed United Nations, because the problem is that the ambition to be inclusive that is in the United Nations also prevents them from taking definite action against certain abusive powers, because the states and the governments that one sometimes have very good reasons to intervene against are also members of the same United Nations, and sometimes they're even placed in the Security Council, and one finds it very difficult to do anything about them. So maybe one should try to look for another kind of coalition of the willing, based on common interest. And maybe, and that is, of course, is a bit, it might be just wishful thinking, but maybe a global crisis can create some kind of reminder to democracies what they have in common with each other, instead of trying to be profitable, each one for themselves, by associating them with various dictatorships all over the world.
Yeah, and certainly the Russia-Ukraine situation it comes to mind. It's Alan did also believe in the rights to future generations, and he wrote a little essay on that, because you don't have actual people, and actual purpose of agents is a prospective purpose of agents. There's distinction he draws there. And you think when the duties to future generation, environmentalism and so forth, seems to require duties to those who are not yet.
Yes, and I think that there is, of course, a continuum between the duties we have to the people who coexist with us, and the duties to their offspring. Because very often when it comes to environmental degradation, the problems are already here. It's only that they will get even worse if they poison waters or deplete natural resources and things like that. But the problem are already with us. So there's a continuum. If one is uncomfortable with the idea about duties to non-existing people, one could start with that we already now are living with it, and even we have a future. It might be less than the one of future generation. We have some years, but even these years should be spent in as good as possible and as reasonable as possible.
Yes, well, we've certainly covered a lot of good ground here, and I've appreciated a chance for us to continue this exploration of Alan's work, and it certainly does reward study. So thank you very much, Per, and
thank you.
Best to you.
Best to you.
Bye-bye.
Nice to meet you. Bye.